Good morning, guys. I would like to talk to you about scene 4 of Streetcar Named Desire today. I don't know if you remember, but the last time we talked, we were dealing with that crazy poker night in Stanley and Stella's apartment. So just to kind of quickly recap that, the boys were playing poker, they were drinking, things kind of got out of hand. Stanley was physically abusive toward his wife. Blanche was very upset about that. Of course, Stella and Stanley do make up at the end and reconcile after that fight. A lot of crazy things occurring there. So anyway, in scene 4, it opens up into the next morning, and we have Stella seeming to sort of be peaceful and enjoying herself in the morning. She's laying there, she's got comics she's reading, she's just seems to be very tranquil. And when Blanche comes in to talk to her, Blanche is sort of shocked by how Stella is dealing with the whole situation from the night before. She even says, on page 63, when I found out you'd been sane enough, I had to come back in here after you and basically talk some sense into you. So, with Stella, everything's business as usual. She almost acts like it never happened. Moving forward on page 64, we see that Stella does give some excuses about Stanley's behavior from the night before. She points out the fact that he had a lot to drink, and of course, if he hadn't had all that, he wouldn't have done what he did, and you could see that he's truly remorseful for it. So anyway, that's Stella making those excuses, and just forgiving of her husband. And she says this is not something new. This is something that he's been this way since they've been married. Even on their wedding night, he, snatched off her heels and was beating out light bulbs with her heels. That's kind of interesting. And of course, to her, it was thrilling. So I guess she's accepting this sort of thrill, and I don't know, it just all goes hand in hand with her. So anyway, but Blanche is not really seeing that this is an ideal relationship, and she tries to talk some sense to her further on page 65 when she says, pull yourself together, face the facts that you're married to a crazy man, like a madman. She's trying to force Stella to see if the relationship isn't good here. And of course, Stella is resistant to that. She's very stubborn. She says, this isn't something that I want to get out of. I don't see why I need to leave Stanley. And she even goes as far as to say on page 66 that we just have to tolerate our each other's habits. So it's just, she brushes it off as just simply a little habit that he has. We have to, accept it. In a way, this tells us that Stella, she chooses her husband over her sister, or over reason, I guess. We'll talk more about that at a later time. So anyway, another thing that's interesting is that Stella, while she's having this conversation with Blanche, begins to start to clean up the house. Kind of reinforces the stereotypes of the time that women clean up after the men, after messes that they've made, whether or not they were big messes or small messes. Probably people today, us today, young people today, I guess, would think, he made that mess, he needs to clean it up. But that's not how it was back then. Anyway, Blanche is still kind of nagging on Stella on page 68 about getting out of this relationship with Stanley, and tries to figure out their options. One of them is Shep Huntley. Okay, this is where we're introduced to somebody that Blanche has been interested in the past, and we know has money. In fact, if you look on page 68, she describes that he has a Cadillac convertible a block long, which we know is hyperbolic. So she's using a hyperbole here and is over-exaggerating how large this Cadillac convertible is. That's Blanche almost any time. She's over the top, constantly over-exaggerating and making something out to be much more grand, and greater than it really is. She sees the world as she wants to, not as it really is. It's not to say that Shep didn't have a nice car or a bigger car, but, according to Blanche, it's just the largest. So anyway, another thing that I thought was interesting on page 68 was Blanche making the comment that she's indifferent to money. Instead, she thinks of money in terms of what it does for you. I don't know if that really makes sense. How could you think of, I mean, for her, money does a lot, or she believes that money would do a lot for her. So I don't really believe that it makes her indifferent to money. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so going further, we're going to skip ahead to page 70 when she's trying to write a letter to this Shep guy, and she says, sister and I in a desperate situation. We'll explain details in later. Would you be interested in? And she kind of like stops, and then she says, oh, you never get anywhere with direct appeals. So that kind of shows you here, Blanche would know. She always disguises what she really wants. She never just comes out with whatever it is. She has to beat around the bush or paint it out to be better than it really is. So she's not a direct person. Another thing that was interesting on page 70 and 71 was that, when Blanche is trying to figure out how much money they have to get out of this situation, obviously we know she doesn't have much. Stella has more than Blanche does. And when Stella asks her, how did you get to be so low on your money and your funds, Blanche isn't really direct. We just talked about that. Isn't really direct about it. She just says money just goes, it goes places. The question that I have for you is, where do you think her money went? My guess is that not only did it go toward funeral expenses, but I also believe it went toward Blanche probably spending money on her clothes and keeping up appearances of being this, wealthy sort of individual. So anyway, she doesn't tell us flat out where she spent it. So again, that tells me it didn't go necessarily toward, everything didn't go toward practical matters. Anyway, moving on, we've got at the bottom of 71, Blanche and Stella are still arguing about Stanley. This is a long conversation. And, Stella argues that Blanche saw Stanley at his worst, and Blanche says, no, I saw him at his best. She basically saw him for what he really is, which is basically an animal. We have these animal references on page 71. Let me read this to you. It says, what such a man has to offer is animal force, and he gave a wonderful exhibition of that. The only way to live with a man is to go to bed with him. So again, that's going back to as an animal, they have just the most primitive needs, which is food, sex, water, just stuff like that. So pretty basic. So he's very primitive. And this is not the only time that she's basically called him primitive and an animal. All right. So moving forward, we've got, Stella sort of reinforcing what Blanche thinks about Stanley when she says that there are things that happen between a man and a woman in the dark that sort of make everything else seem unimportant. So just really highlights the fact that their relationship is one that's of a physical nature. That's what seems to mesmerize Stella and keep her where she is. Okay, she's under this spell because of what he does for her intimately. And Blanche points that out to her. She's like, that's not enough to stay with somebody. If you look on page 73, she says, what you're talking about is brutal desire. Just desire. The name of that, rattle-trap streetcar that bangs through the corridor, up one narrow street and down another. So she equates Stella's relationship to Stanley with this rickety old streetcar that's in service right now in the corridor. It's dangerous to ride that streetcar. She's saying it's bound for disaster, much like what's going on with Stella and Stanley, that they're bound to have a disastrous relationship. So this is sort of symbolic here. Obviously the whole play is called Streetcar Named Desire. So, it all is centered around that relationship and what's kept them together. And probably other things that we're going to talk about in the next few scenes. So I can't give that away. Anyway, Blanche points out that, it is because of desire, and it is why she is where she is. She got to be in this position because she has been in relationships like that and has experienced disastrous consequences, and that's why she's here banging on Stella's door. So older sis has this experience, is trying to mentor younger sis. Younger sis thinks she knows it all, and that can't go very well. I'm not saying that Blanche has all the knowledge and is always right, but I do believe that she has a point here. you know, that's up to you to evaluate whether or not you think Blanche is correct in the way she feels about Stanley and whether or not she should stay with Stella. Going further down on page 73, we have about the time that Stanley arrives, comes into the scene, we also have a train approaching. And we almost could think that the Tennessee Williams sort of made this thing happen at the same time Stanley enters, because, you know, Stanley's kind of like a train. This is kind of like a train wreck. You know, also like a train, when Stanley hears what they're about to be saying, he's going to be steaming, much like a steam train would do. So anyway, I think he's coming at everything with full force as well. Like there are lots of things that you can like connect Stanley with the train. So anyway, he does come in and he hears more of the conversation that I'm about to get into, and you can imagine how he would feel. How would you feel if you heard these things? When Blanche asks to speak plainly on page 74, she says, starting off, he is common. You know, before she has said, he is simple. I think that, you know, it's kind of insulting. It's kind of rude to think this about him. Stella does agree. But going further down, she just said, you know, there is nothing gentlemanlike about him. You know, back where they lived, the men would have been a little different than what Stanley is like. She even says there's somewhat downright bestial about him. Again, animal, beast. And then we've got this very long paragraph on 74 where she just really lays into Stanley. She says he acts like an animal. He has animal's habits. He eats like one. He moves like one. He talks like one. There's something subhuman about him. He's ape-like. He's not quite a human. You know, Stanley is a survivor of the Stone Age. So again, very primitive in thought and probably behavior. You know, he brings raw meat home from the jungle, you know, and, you know, he'll strike you and grunt and then kiss you. And just, again, very caveman-like. Swilling and gnawing and hulking and, you know, things like that. So anyway, the general point is that he's an animal. He's very simple. You don't belong with him. You're not used to this sort of thing. Don't know what you're doing here. Get out. Don't hang back with the brutes, is what she says. You're here. Here is Stanley. So that's what she's trying to get at with Stella. And of course, remember, Stanley he's not in the room yet, but he hears everything. Okay. So that's very interesting. And what's even more interesting is on page 75, Stanley never does come in and bust in on that conversation, and, you know, he doesn't come after Blanche after hearing this. He, in fact, keeps it inside, says nothing about it. And my question to you was, why do you think he did that? Why did he choose not to confront Blanche right after she said these awful things about him? We'll find out probably more of that when we get into scene 5. But the final thing that I want to conclude with here is what's also on page 75, where when Stanley does come in, Stella goes right to him and embraces him fiercely in full view of Blanche. So she wants Blanche to see her showing this affection for her husband, and he laughs and you know, clasps her to him. My guess is this in a small way, and Blanche doesn't realize this, is he's getting back at her because he knows that Stella is choosing him over her sister. Okay, you can see this right here. He grins at Blanche, kind of like, ha ha, look what I have done. Look what you're not accomplishing. So anyway, there'll be more of that where Stella will choose Stanley over her sister when we get into some more scenes. But anyway, let me know if you have questions. Just shoot me an email and I'll help you out when I can. So see you later.